Today, how to fix the inflation problem. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics World. Now, this post covering finance and property news. Well, of course, the official narrative from central banks is that inflation is too high, it needs to be crushed, and the instrument of choice is higher interest rates. By the way, most of them have walked away from the quantitative easing and tightening part of the story, looking to interest rates to control demand and bring demand and supply back into equilibrium. But the truth is, of course, this is a very narrow path. And as Phil Lowe said last week at Senate Estimates, it is certainly not a done deal necessarily. But there's a broader question here that we should be asking, which is, but what other levers potentially could be pulled, perhaps by government, to try and help tackle the inflation beast? And in fact, if the government was more proactive with some of these different programs, would they be able then to see interest rates fall or at least not rise any higher? Well, there are a few levers which are available. One which Phil Lowe is often talking about at the moment is the productivity lever, as discussed at length in Senate Estimates last week. And it's worth just listening to the discussion specifically around this.
You raised was wages, and the particular topic we're focused on at the moment is the growth in unit labour costs. So that's unit labour costs is the difference between wages growth and productivity growth.
Yep.
Wages growth at the moment's roughly 3.75%. Historically, that hasn't been a problem. That would have been a good number. What we've been hoping to achieve over time is an average inflation rate of 2.5%. And the country hopefully will deliver 1% productivity growth. And so wages growth of around 3.5% I thought was a reasonable benchmark, and we're pretty close to that now. So nominal wage growth at the moment isn't a problem. And nominal wage growth has not been the source of inflation, I want to make it clear. The problem is weak productivity growth. Over the last 3 years, there has been no increase in the average output produced per hour worked in Australia. No increase for 3 years. No productivity growth for 3 years. And that's a problem. And that means that unit labour cost growth in Australia is quite high. We've got wages growth of 3.75% and no productivity growth. So that's the issue that I've been drawing attention to in my public comments, that it's a problem for the country, and it's a problem for the inflation outlook as well. The central banks in other countries are facing exactly the same situation. Growth in unit labour costs is too high. In other countries, wages growth is too strong. In Australia it isn't, but productivity growth is weak, and it's a problem. If unit labour cost growth is 3.5% to 4%, then it's hard to have 2.5% inflation. So that's the issue that I'm drawing attention to, and the best solution to this is a lift in productivity growth.
Can I ask, just to contextualise those comments that have been reported and you've reiterated now, about why or whether the bank will need to continue rate rises if there is wages growth without productivity growth?
Well, it all depends. We're in very much a data-dependent mode. We've increased interest rates a lot. Monetary policy is restrictive and it's working. And whether we need to increase rates further will depend not only what happens with unit labour costs, what happens with the global economy, with inflation expectations and consumer spending. So they're the variables that we're looking at. It's not a single variable that drives our decisions, it's the collection of those variables. And we do need to pay attention to growth in unit labour costs, because over long periods of time, the price level increases pretty much in line with growth in unit labour costs. There are periods where they differ, but over the medium term, those two things grow together. So if we're going to have 2.5% inflation, we cannot have unit labour costs persistently growing at 3.5% or 4%. So that's a consideration, but there are many other considerations as well.
So is there a real risk then like we've seen occur overseas, that wages may get out of control and drive up those inflationary pressures?
I'm not. I mean, in the US, wages growth is 5%, and in some European countries it's similar. I'm not concerned we're going to see that here. You know, it's a possibility, but it seems to me a fairly low possibility. Our forecast is that wage growth picks up a bit more, but the wage price index grows maybe by 4% this year. So that, in the normal course of things, 4% wages growth is not problematic. But it is problematic if we have no productivity growth. The reasons for weak productivity growth are complex. I think partly it's due to the pandemic. Businesses were in survival mode rather than growth mode, and investment slowed down, and there were disruptions, and kind of you couldn't get investment goods and you couldn't get people. So all those things hurt productivity growth during the pandemic. That's now behind us, so perhaps we'll now see productivity growth pick up. If we do, and we return to 1% productivity growth, which is what we've done historically, then the current level of wage growth is not problematic. But if we don't, then there is a reality we have to face into. If there's no productivity growth, then it's hard to have an increase in real wages. That's the reality we really have to face into, and we need to take that into account in our decisions. But as I said, it's just one factor. There are a lot of other factors as well.
Should we be concerned about the stickiness of inflation? Because obviously around the world we've seen inflation remain higher for longer than expected. And while policy responses are working, they do have a lag. Is there a risk that potentially we could declare victory on inflation because we've already believed it to have peaked, and that potentially we could make the situation worse, make inflation last for longer?
Well, we're not going to declare victory until victory is achieved, so we won't be declaring victory prematurely. You highlight the persistence of inflation overseas, and it's exactly the same issue that I've just been talking about. Goods price inflation has come down, and the supply side problems of COVID are being resolved. Commodity prices are back to where they were before the pandemic, and even food prices in global markets are now coming down. So that's all helping, and that's driving headline inflation lower. The issue is services price inflation, which is persistent. And it's persistent because growth in unit labour costs in many countries is high. Wage growth 5% in the US, and productivity growth low. So that's underlying the persistence in inflation around the world. And it's a concern.
You've spoken much about productivity growth, and I don't think you'll get any arguments from this side of the table about why that's so important, but perhaps for the benefit of the Hansard, can you specifically explain why productivity growth is important and what the drivers of productivity growth are?
What the drivers are, that's kind of complex. I can go to why it's important, because the only way that we can increase real wages and real incomes is to become better and smarter at doing things, to produce more for each hour we go to work. That's how we become wealthier. If every day we go to work there's no increase in what we do and how productive we are, then we can't pay ourselves higher real wages, the value of our assets won't go up, and there'll be more strain on the public balance sheet. So productivity growth is the way we become wealthier, we pay ourselves higher wages, and the government has more resources to provide the services that we want. So it's incredibly important. What we do about it, well, we do have an organisation called the Productivity Commission, which has written many reports, and it has many very good ideas in it. So there are a lot of things that could be done. The challenge is doing them. So there's no shortage of ideas here. And if you're interested, I once again commend those reports to you.
Point is simply this, that if you can get productivity improvements, then wage rises are feasible. Without it, it's a problem. It will just create more inflation. And the point is, of course, that those productivity levers are not the gift of the central bank, but are the gift predominantly of the federal government. So where are the productivity programs from the state and federal governments, I ask myself, and I haven't really seen much sight nor sound of them. So that's a major problem. Now, Phil Lowe at Senate Estimates also referred specifically to the rental sector and talked about this being a significant factor. In fact, the rental growth is one of the strongest levers which is lifting inflation higher.
Welcome, Governor, and Dr. Jones, and thanks very much for your appearance this morning. What I hear you saying, Governor, is that vigilance is still required.
Indeed.
Thank you very much. I just want to turn to the matter of rents and stronger expectations in regards to rental increases across Australia. In your monetary statement of May, at page 69, you make the point that any inflation improvements could be offset by stronger outlooks for rent inflation, reflecting the strength in recent data and the upward revisions to the population growth estimate. Yeah. So for the committee, could you just give us an understanding of how you see the current rental issue? What proportion of the future inflation challenge do you think rents will make up? And any observations you might make?
No, it's a very significant issue because rents is the single largest component in the CPI. So what happens there is very important, and we're expecting growth in rents in as measured in the CPI to be kind of around close to 10% this year. It's very tough, and some people are experiencing bigger increases in rents than that. So it's really hurting some people. The underlying issue here is supply and demand in the rental market. The vacancy rates in many cities are very low. I was in Perth earlier in the month, and there it's basically almost impossible to find something. The rental vacancy rate's the lowest it's ever been. There are a few things that have contributed to that. During the pandemic, the average number of people living in each household declined. People wanted more space, they were working from home, rents actually declined for a while, and people said, well, rather than have a flatmate, I'll just have an office at home. And so the average number of people living in each dwelling declined, and that increased the demand as a result for the total number of dwellings. So that's been going on. And the other thing that's now happening is a big increase in population. The population's increasing by 2% this year. Are there 2% more houses? No, hardly. The rate of addition to the housing stock is very low. So I've got a lot of people coming into the country.
A lot of people
wanting to live alone or kind of not move out of home, and it just doesn't. It doesn't work. The way that this ends up fixing itself, unfortunately, is through higher housing prices and higher rents. Because as rents go up, people decide not to move out of home, or you don't have that home office, you kind of get a flatmate.
Which is a fix that people can only expect to happen over the medium to longer term. It's not a fix that is going to happen immediately.
Well, the increase in supply can't happen immediately, but the higher prices
rents
do lead people to economise on housing, don't they? Kids don't move out of home because the rents are too expensive, or you decide to get a flatmate or a housemate because that's the price mechanism at work. We need more people on average to live in each dwelling, and prices do that.
His argument is if you get more people living in the same housing stock, that could actually alleviate the supply-demand disequilibrium. But of course, the truth is that the real lever here is actually reducing migration. One of the reasons why there's so much demand for rental accommodation is actually the very high migration. We have, I think, over the next couple of years, probably something like 700,000 people expected to land in Australia. And that's going to put a lot of pressure on all of our services and, of course, accommodation. So surely, if this is something which needs to be tackled, then migration should be turned way, way down. So why is it that we've got a government that's having a strategy to make a big Australia even bigger by continuing to drive strong migration, including from places like India and Asia, as well as Europe? And there's another factor to bear in mind too, because on the demand-supply disequilibrium question of property, we know that there are more than 1.2 million vacant properties across the country. That's based on the census from a couple of years ago. Now, there are a number of reasons why properties are vacant. In some cases, it's a second home. In some cases, it's property that's actually been taken out of the normal market and is being run as an Airbnb or equivalent service, short-term lets, where in fact many investors are able to get slightly better returns. And we also know that there are some properties that have been held long-term vacant, particularly by international investors, and they have no intention of using those properties or indeed letting those properties because they're just riding the capital growth. So here is another lever the government could consider, which is how you tackle the question of vacant properties and how you release some of those back into the market, potentially for rental or maybe even purchase. So why isn't there a conversation specifically around spare properties and getting them actively contributing to alleviating the rental crisis, bearing in mind that the rental sector is one of the strongest factors driving inflation to new highs? And there's one other, and that is that another very strong lever driving inflation is actually energy prices. Of course, energy went up, let's say 25% recently, and electricity prices are due to go up again down the East Coast by about 25% from 1 July. Now, the reason why energy prices are so high is because of the way that the gas market is working, and the East Coast states in particular are exposed to the international gas price, not least because gas is sucked out of the ground in Australia, and then we have to compete on the international markets to be able to actually get it back for our own use. In WA, of course, it's a different model, and their prices are much lower. So if the government was serious about tackling inflation, then they would seriously tackle the question of energy prices, and particularly electricity prices, and get the gas reservation situation sorted out. In other words, reserve sufficient gas to supply the domestic market in Australia at a price which is more in line with the local market rather than the international market. Think of Kuwait and oil. How is it that we, who are one of the best producers of particularly liquid gas, are also a country that is paying through the nose for our energy supplies? So if you stand back and just think about it, here are a series of levers that could get interest rates to drop and inflation to dissipate. But all of those are not the gift of the RBA, but they're the gift of the government. So my question to the federal government in particular is, what are you doing about productivity? What are you doing to reduce migration? And what are you doing to tackle the rental situation and specifically the electricity and gas crisis? The trouble is, of course, that many of those programs would actually cut across the corporate interests of big Australia. And it's quite clear to me that the Labor government is very strongly aligned with corporate Australia, rather than actually thinking of it holistically and thinking about the impact on ordinary businesses and households across the country. As a result, the Reserve Bank governor will, of course, have to put rates up higher. And, of course, the federal government will be able to blame the Reserve Bank for creating the problem rather than them taking ownership. Just remember that the Labor government is trying to walk away from having any control over what the RBA is doing, so that they can actually say it's nothing to do with us, it's all somebody else's issue. So my thought is simply this, that there are levers that could be pulled to get inflation to drop, and quickly, but it seems to me that the Labor government is not playing ball, is not interested, and is preparing simply to outsource the problem to the RBA, and probably ultimately Phil Lowe will be forced to resign. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.